All right, good day, folks. Thanks for joining us at Finding the One for Our Sun here again. My name is Matthew Brungen. I'm your host here at Madison 365. Please hit subscribe at YouTube, Spotify, Stitcher, or Apple Podcasts. So again, thanks for joining us and welcome. Today, I'm going to be talking a bit more, not a bit more, but a bit about how Trump is much more of a symptom of what's wrong with the United States than the disease himself. And a bit how even electing Hillary Clinton would not have prevented an authoritarian figure, right, in becoming U.S. president. This was really ultimately the end result of things and decisions that both parties have made, right, that have deepened a very corrupt rot, right? The GOP is the most rotten of these aspects of it, but Democrats aren't, innocent of this and are infected of this rot as well. Many of them absolutely are. This is really something that's been. This country's been fighting, really, in a lot of ways since its inception, particularly when you want to look at it through the lens of those that are people of color and Black folks and indigenous nations and populations, right? Within that, and these authoritarian leanings within this country, and particularly when it has come to racial and ethnic minorities of sorts, if you will. And this is a problem. And there's been really no accountability for corrupt individuals, for war crimes, and crimes against humanity in any of our leaders. And that's part of it. There's been no, really since FDR, really initiative to confront particularly corrupt corporatism and the military-industrial complex. Now, FDR didn't really even try to attack the military-industrial complex. What grew out of World War II was the military-industrial complex, if we want to be clear about that. But nobody was held responsible for, one, entering the Vietnam War and entering Vietnam on false pretenses, right? Nobody at the national level, at the real leadership level, was held responsible for any war crimes committing during an illegal war, an illegal invasion, right? Of Vietnam, and it very much was an occupation and invasion of Vietnam. Nobody's been held responsible for illegal coups and supporting of vicious authoritarian figures, particularly right-wing authoritarian figures within, since World War II in this country, right? You had basically quasi-fascist operations in Greece, and you had horrible right-wing authoritarians being and death squads being supported in South America, and coups in Africa of leaders that attempted to really break away from being indebted to the West, right? And colonialism and neocolonialism and anybody that attempted to really actually assert their independence from being indebted to the West was accused of being a, Soviet satellite state and so on and so forth, really down the line, and ended up, would be overturned and having coups or invaded. This is really, these are real things. The history of the CIA it's not really about spreading democracy. It's about securing American interests. And really, American capitalism is state-sponsored capitalism. And kind of what I'm saying is that the state really uses its authority to support capital, right? And that is its main kind of driver, is the support of capital. And so with we have this history of racism, and which has made it particularly difficult to create any sort of deeply entrenched progressive movements as race, as soon as race would be injected into the conversations, whites that might support much more progressive and egalitarian policies all of a sudden lose support for those policies, right? So, some of it's built and baked into our populace and our psyche. But nobody was held responsible for the Vietnam War. We had COINTELPRO, which was the FBI spying on Americans. Nobody was held responsible for that. And there were assassinations and killings and really messed up legal work being done within all that, right? Nobody was held responsible for that. Nobody was held responsible for CIA experiments on Americans, if you want to, think about their experience with LSD and mind control and so really down the line. Nobody's really been held responsible for eugenics experiments and illegal medical experiments within the United States either, particularly at the leadership level, right? Nixon was pardoned and wasn't really held responsible for his actions, really responsible, right? These wars of oil and invasions and down the line, nobody really, outside of some hand waved away and symbolic kind of gestures, ultimately, right? Minimal types of accountability were held for Iran-Contra, which saw with, illegal weapon sales and supporting the violent Contras, right? As well as CIA operative bringing cocaine into the United States, fueling the crack epidemic. Nobody's been held responsible for launching the drug war specifically to target Black Americans and leftists. Again, this is documented stuff, right? Our banks are ripe with corruption. There's a recent report came out that said outside of some slaps on the wrist where they pay some fines, they've been helping laundering billions of dollars of global criminals of drugs and human trafficking. And down the line, there has been no real enforcement of this, even before Trump, right? These were slaps on the wrist and just fines. And actually, you can thank Eric Holder for part of this, not just the failure to break up the banks in their, at times, legalized corruption, but he authored a memo in the 90s suggesting that it would do more, basically is economically prudent or, kind of some really BS about how we shouldn't charge leaders of these banks and even corporations with criminal offenses, on how basically it should just be fines towards the corporations, and we shouldn't hold the people that helped oversee or execute these things responsible and put them in jail and have real consequences, right? The IRS, even and now, doesn't have the tools to investigate, large fraud. And it doesn't investigate large fraud. Most of the tax fraud, most of the fraud that it goes after is small-time, low-income folks, right? Low-income and middle-class folks. So, you're having these wealthy individuals that can commit mass fraud and face zero to minimal consequences. Or if they do face consequences, they get sent away to some resort of a jail. Oftentimes, they get to pick their jails, right? When they're committed of these white collar crimes, and these white collar crimes are enormously corrupt. So you have that on one hand, like really this capitalism that is rotten, and many will say you can't have capitalism that isn't rotten, and they're kind of right. Capitalism is rooted on exploitation, particularly of low income and middle class workers. It's exploitation of workers, right? To maximize profits of shareholders and those in the kind of the capital position, right? Throughout its history, you've always had exploited workers or those enslaved to then generate capital, right? And that's where a lot of folks really kind of enter into this being anti-capitalist, where they might not necessarily be socialists or communists, right? Where myself, I'm anti-capitalist, we're seeing this exploitative system, right? Which is rotten, right? So you have all this rotten stuff going in there within its roots. So you have these folks just not being held responsible for illegal or legalized corruption, and they're having massive influence on our politics, with our foreign policies and domestic policies being used to support this capital. And we see that particularly with the expansion of war powers within the president, which was, you had this ultimately almost symbolic restriction placed upon presidents to launch military efforts post-Vietnam. It didn't really do much, particularly when it came to special forces operations and intelligence operations across the globe. And intelligence operations increasingly, since the Vietnam War, have looked more and more militarized, right? And have just escalated immensely since 9/11. And then with 9/11, you had an absolute explosion and expansion of war powers acts that no Congress has work to rein in, that Obama didn't rein in and had a chance to rein in, which set up somebody like Trump that wanted to take advantage of these expanded powers to take advantage of them. And he has. He's absolutely expanded the war on terror through drone wars. He's not a anti-occupation, this anti-war, like some of these weird folks like Glenn Greenwald like to think, right? It's purely rhetoric, right? And then you had the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, which sounds fascist to begin with, and is ultimately really a fascist organization along with ICE. So you had this infrastructure set up to effectively target and spy on American residents and citizens. The erosion of civil liberties, and let's not forget that Obama dropped a bomb on a foreign American citizen that, joined a terrorist organization, but was still an American citizen and was afforded no due process and was seen as an enemy combatant, right? And I guess how folks justify that in their head. And I hate to fall into a slippery slope, but all these actions do add up. It's not necessarily a slippery slope. It was step by step by step by step by step into this direction of authoritarianism, of concentrating authority in the executive, right? Of eroding our so-called checks and balances, of setting up infrastructure that spies on Americans and targets Americans, along with this economic rot that concentrates wealth in a, smaller and smaller, group of folks in hands that have outside impact, outside, power, really a lot of power on our political systems and have much more influence than anybody in the streets, right? They have a lot of power and influence, and if they want something, they'll get it done. Congress has continued to let go of its own power, its own checks and balances. The Supreme Court has not always, but historically been much more conservative and much more leaning towards the side, particularly more of supporting a racial and gender caste system within the United States. The courts in general are historically conservative. And then you add on top of these things like these secret courts where, they're secret, right? And this is part of this, the war on terror stuff, but it helped set up, again, this infrastructure of spying and targeting U.S. citizens and targeting and invading our privacy and giving more power to the executive branch. That, along the lines of, again, militarizing police, really kind of continues to dig into it. But you look at all of this stuff that Trump has been able to exploit to great effect. A lot of it he didn't set up. A lot of the norms were broken before him, be it under Obama or under George W. Bush, Clinton, Herbert Walker Bush, Reagan, Ford, Nixon, Carter, even LBJ, Eisenhower. It's this slow erosion over time. And Hillary Clinton was not going to do anything to turn back the clock on any of this stuff. Obama didn't, and pretty a lot of these things and this infrastructure being set up and these decisions she was a part of and she supported. We're at the end game of where these things are leading. And then you throw in the GOP, which has become, again, this party of white identity politics, and really has since 1964, where no Democratic president since the 1964 Civil Rights Bill received the majority of the white vote. And they've increasingly included, from dog whistle politics. You saw that with Nixon's law and order rhetoric. Reagan perfected these dog whistle politics. Lee Atwater has spoken at great lengths about this, or at lengths about the creation of what we call dog whistle politics. And so they've married themselves and made a coalition, particularly with right-wing religious groups, white identity politics, and corrupt capitalism. Or, I mean, it's a bit redundant, but really intense extremist capitalism, right? And moved these things into this coalition and brought these all under really one light, one header, supported a lot of this corruption, where the Dems didn't really do much to offer an ideological alternative that much at all, outside of not being a party of clear white nationalism and white identity politics, while also not being a party that actively dismantled our racial caste system. They just supported the status quo, while also buying into a lesser extent the type of capitalism. Again, you saw this with globalization and neoliberalism, particularly, that Clinton and Obama supported, right? The trickle-down economics that was bunked when Reagan implemented it, that's been bunked. There's been no really change in this trickle-down economics. No radical reshaping of our courts to make them more democratic. And then even then, you talk about the Electoral College, which has ended up creating a tyranny of the minority. And let's be clear, the Electoral College was created in such a way that empowered slave states. It is a legacy of slavery. It wasn't created to prevent the tyranny of the majority. It was created in a lot of ways to empower slave states. Slave states, they liked it a bit, right? They wanted to count their slaves as part of the census to give them more political capital and political power. In a lot of ways, it entrenched slavery within the Constitution in some very real ways. But this was the ultimate endpoint. If it wasn't Trump, it would have been somebody else. There are no national Democratic leaders right now, or there weren't at that point. You had some folks like Elizabeth Warren that wanted to really attack a lot of this legalized corruption and the economic rot. There's been really no strong force to counteract some of these other measures, such as the War Powers Authorization and the military-industrial complex, Department of Homeland Security and ICE and the militarization of police and these other infrastructures in place. These are the things that are at the center of the rot, that are the disease, where it makes possible for folks like McConnell and Trump to thrive, to have and maintain power. And that's before we even get into issues of our corporate media and our corporate press and how they're not going to provide a narrative that counteracts much of this stuff and falls into this false dichotomy of both sidesism, right? Like that somehow both sides are equally weighted in opinion. And even then, it's unbalanced, where they're much more likely to not hold the right accountable to something than the left. I mean, this stuff is well documented. I know both sides are like, well, they don't do whatever. This stuff is really well documented on the bias of the media for the right. This liberal bias is BS in a lot of ways. I mean, we see this in the coverage of Trump as well, on how they particularly cover Trump. But they're very scared of a right-wing reaction. And they've been bullied by the right wing in a lot of real ways. I mean, you see, there's a big blow up of Obama in his tan suit, and which with things that Trump has done far worse in a lot of different ways, they, might spend minutes or hours covering, where you might have had 3 days or week-long coverage of butthurt emails, right, within the media, when multiple folks within Trump administration have used personal emails for official government business and have found ways to benefit themselves from all of this, right? But again, they're a symptom of a rot that has long been growing and festering within the United States. We would have ended up at this point. So what do? Right? Well, I think the first step is absolutely getting rid of those that are actively taking advantage of it and actively breaking down more and more of these structures and pushing us more and more towards actively pushing us more and more towards a path of authoritarianism. So voting Trump out, voting McConnell out, right? These are the type of things that are needed. But I don't know if Biden has it in him to really start deconstructing some of these institutions and some of these decisions. He might just be forced to, because of how far we've gone over the last 4 years. Granted, you could say George Bush II, George W., really kind of pushed this boulder to the edge of the cliff and broke a heck of a lot of norms and really, really helped spread this rot to a huge point. And Obama didn't do much to heal it and to fix it. And that left this cavern of rot for Trump to take advantage of. So hopefully he's going to start implementing policies to take power away from these banks and these corporate entities, to start taking money out of politics. Hopefully he's going to start getting rid of the ability for the executive and the expansive war powers. Hopefully he's going to start dismantling the Homeland Security and ICE and demilitarizing the police, expanding the Supreme Court and packing it, right? And doing these steps that spread democracy and you're talking about adding states and expansion in the Senate. So again, it's not this tyranny by the minority. And again, let's be real, the Senate again was much more to appease aristocrats, particularly Southern aristocrats, and a legacy of slavery, right? Not this weird high-minded thing that was invented later, like the mentality of the tyranny of the majority, and that was a mentality invented much later than actually the actual conception of the Constitution. So hopefully he's going to do that. But we also have to start doing that. That means that we have to start voting for those folks. That means in primaries, you vote for the person you want to vote for, not who you think other people are going to support, right? Vote for who you think is right, to do what's right. It means voting for those folks in local and state elections. It means organizing. It means mass mobilization, and not seeing elections as the beginning or the end all. They are just a tactic in all of this. It means getting involved in judicial politics and voting more for judges and your sheriffs and your district attorneys down the line, and particularly organizing around racial and economic justice and creating this pressure, creating not just that, but also, expanding mutual aid and supporting one another beyond our current mechanisms, because our cities and states, one, are failing and a lot of times don't have the resources to do what's needed. It's going to be hard. The work is not going to be done in November. It's not going to be done even in November if Biden wins, and if Trump, and if Biden, I should say, actually takes office, even if he wins, right? The work's not going to be done. We're going to have to organize against Biden in ways that push him to do things that he's going to have to do that might be against what he wants to do. It means we're going to have to organize in the House and the Senate. Start taking over the Senate. It means getting rid of, pressuring senators to, if Dems take over the Senate, to get rid of the filibuster. And really targeting, again, state elections and building these things up and dismantling these institutions. We have to be active players in this as citizens and residents of this country in combating this authoritarian nature and expanding this democracy, expanding voting rights, getting rid of partisan districting, right? Hopefully supporting other mechanisms of democracy, such as, particularly in states, in creating proportional representation, creating, why am I blanking out on different types of votes instead of ranked choice voting. Boom, there we go, ranked choice voting, and supporting ranked choice voting. So we'd expand the type of people that might be able to win and make it easier for folks that aren't fully bought into this system to win. So many different things, and we have to be active players in it. But Trump's a symptom, not the disease. And only we can cure the disease. There's going to be no political savior. We are the only people that can save us from ourselves. Well, that's it for today, I suppose. Stop myself from going on more and more about this. But thanks for joining us here at Finding the Warmth of Our Suns. You can find us at Madison 365, the podcast. Just go in and search Finding the Warmth of Our Sun on YouTube, Spotify, Stitcher, and Apple Podcasts. So thank you very much. And I hope you have yourself a good and healthy week and wear masks, because this state is a sick one right now. So please wear your mask and be socially distant and support those that need help. All right.
This is 365 Media.